Hello, I'm Troy Abels from Hanford, California, and you are listening to Gospel Tangents.
Hi, I'm Rick Bennett, and I'm excited to have Greg Prince back on the show. Greg's our first two-time guest on the show, so I'm really excited about that. And so we're going to talk about his new book, Gay Rights in the Mormon Church. We'll talk about not only Prop 8, but Prop 22, as well as the same-sex fight in Hawaii. So I think you'll find this really interesting. But in our first segment, we're going to talk about why he decided to write this book. It's going to be very interesting, so check out our conversation. I also want to give a shout out to Rod, our newest Patreon subscriber. And I know for those of you who like to hear the whole thing, just subscribe for $5 on patreon.com/gospeltangents. You can hear this whole interview. So that'll help support Gospel Tangents to keep us on the air. Oh, and one other thing, Troy Abels, the guy who introduced this, he's got his own podcast on YouTube. It's called The Last Dispensation. And he'll talk about end times prophecies in the book of Revelations. And if that's what you enjoy, check out his podcast there. So called The Last Dispensation. Now back to our conversation.
Well, welcome to Gospel Tangents. I have a fantastic guest. Could you go ahead and introduce yourself?
I'm Greg Prince, just visiting Salt Lake from Maryland.
Well, that's right. So it's great to have you here in Salt Lake, and thanks for coming on Gospel Tangents.
You're welcome.
You're my first two-time guest, so that's exciting. So you've got a new book out. Tell us about your book.
The book is called Gay Rights in the Mormon Church, Intended Actions, Unintended Consequences.
Okay.
It came about very gradually, and I didn't realize for several years what the initial catalyst was. It happened in the aftermath of Prop 8 in 2008. I was visiting my daughter, who was a student at Boston University, and got a phone call from Helen Whitney. Helen, the prior year, had produced a 4-hour documentary called The Mormons, which was broadcast on PBS. So I had gotten to know her over the course of 2 years in her preparing that documentary. She said, my best friend Andrew Solomon, who is a writer for The New Yorker, a writer of some award-winning books, has turned on me because of Prop 8. He said, how could you have said anything nice in your documentary about this evil church that helped to pass Prop 8? And
Wow.
then she asked if I could help to repair the friendship. That took a long time. We spent almost a year in occasional email correspondence trying to get the temperature down. Eventually, he agreed to do an article for Dialogue, but was involved in writing a monumental book called Far from the Tree. And so he never got around to doing the article, but I called him and said, what if we do an interview instead? So I traveled to New York, spent an afternoon with him. That interview was published in Dialogue, and it's a remarkable interview. Andrew could easily have just gone broadside against the church, and he could have attacked it for being a homophobic church. Although he didn't pull back completely, he certainly was critical of the church's actions in that interview. He said, I have achieved with my husband John a level of happiness that we didn't think was possible since we became legally married. And then he said, I don't understand why the Mormon Church or any church would want to deprive people of that level of happiness. A very interesting way of putting it, and it caused me to start to rethink where I was. I was not homophobic, but I just was not aware of all of the nuances of the LGBTQ world. But that didn't drive me to write a book immediately. It was just the first in a series of things that pushed me in that direction. The second was when I came to know Rick Jacobs, almost by accident. Rick is a gay activist, lives in California, was the founder of a political action group called the Courage Campaign. In 2008, with Prop 8, that organization focused all of its efforts on trying to defeat Prop 8. When I met Rick, he quickly realized that I wasn't the stereotype of Mormons that he had thought. He said, "You're a reasonable guy." That began a friendship that lasts to this day, as does my friendship with Andrew Solomon. But both of them sensitized me to nuances that I had just not considered before. Mm-hmm. Another pivotal event was when I was asked to join the board of directors of Affirmation. Affirmation's been around for over 30 years. It is an independent organization founded by LDS or former LDS gay men, but it's inclusive of the LGBTQ world. And in 2012, the newly elected president, Randall Thacker, reached out to me and asked if I would be on the board, saying that he wanted to turn the organization into one that built bridges rather than burning bridges. For its history prior to that time, Affirmation had mostly been an organization of older gay Mormon men who were yelling at the church. And he changed that. I had a 5-year stint on the board. It was an amazing opportunity to get to know at a very fundamental level so many people with whom I would not have had contact otherwise. So that gradual accumulation of knowledge of associations finally led me to the point where I thought there are stories here that haven't been told but need to be told. Initially, I thought I would write a book about Prop 8 and the Mormon Church's role in it. Because even though people knew that there had been a role, there had not been anything published that tried to take a comprehensive look at that. When I started with Prop 8, I quickly began to realize that Prop 8 wasn't the whole story. That reached backwards into Prop 22, which was similar legislation in California 8 years earlier, and that in turn was related to the Hawaii lawsuit that began in the early 1990s, which was really the first time when the courts took up the issue of marriage equality in any serious fashion. Enough so that people thought that that would be the turning point. They thought, because of the way the lawsuit was progressing, that Hawaii would become the first state to legalize same-sex marriage. And there was a national freakout as a result. Because of the full faith and credit clause of the U.S. Constitution, what is legal in one state must be accepted by other states and by the federal government unless there are existing laws in those states or in the federal government that would run to the contrary. So as the Hawaii lawsuit progressed, you had a cascade of amendments to state constitutions, of state laws, of federal law. The Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, directly resulted as a response to Hawaii. And everybody was freaking out that same-sex marriage was somehow going to overtake the whole country. That's when the Mormon Church first decided to walk across the street, and rather than focusing its efforts inward, in other words, its relationship, its policies towards gay Latter-day Saints, it got into the public square and became a major player in the Hawaii lawsuit and subsequent Hawaii legislation, but it didn't have a high profile there, primarily because it took great pains not to have one. It created with the Catholic Church a front organization called Hawaii's Future Today, and unless you really knew where to look, you wouldn't have known that the church at a very high level, meaning the First Presidency, Quorum of the 12, and the 70, were operating substantially in Hawaii. It also didn't have as high a profile because it was on the majority side of the issue. This is the 1990s. A strong majority of people throughout the country were against same-sex marriage. So it was riding the crest of a benevolent wave. Same thing happened in 2000 with Prop 22 in California. there was still a strong majority that was against same-sex marriage. When we got to 2008, what they didn't realize is that the sands had started to shift, that more people were rethinking their biases and moving to the other side on the issue. But the other thing that had happened that was crucial with Prop 8 that the church didn't factor in is that in earlier legal battles, the gays were trying to get something they'd never had. But when Prop 22 was struck down by the California Supreme Court in the spring of 2008, there was a window where gay couples in California could be legally married, and tens of thousands were legally married. Then Prop 8 came in, and when it was passed, it took away something that they had owned. So it was fundamentally different in that respect from the earlier period where these people were trying to get something they had never had. Then they got it, then it was taken away.
Okay.
And that changed the landscape enormously.
Well, that's very interesting. So it's funny how you've gone from, how did you get to writing the book to all these things back? And I want to push back a little bit farther if we could, because I know last night at Benchmark Books you had mentioned Elder Oaks was kind of the architect and had a memo from, I believe it was 1984?
It was.
Wasn't that the same year he was called as an apostle?
It was either the same year or shortly after that. It might have been 83, I'm not sure.
Okay.
But shortly after he became an apostle. And it was a fairly lengthy memorandum that became the playbook for the church, not just in the marriage equality issue, but in the overall treatment of LGBTQ people within the church.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that then? Or what was kind of the playbook there?
The playbook was, one fundamental issue within that playbook was that, look, we need to cast this as a moral issue and not as a civil rights issue. Because he realized that if the public, including the public within the church, began to look at it as a basic civil rights issue, it would be an uphill slog for the church that they may not win. If they could paint it with morality paint, then they could carry the day much more easily. And that has been the playbook ever since and continues to be the playbook today.
Isn't that the same playbook that the church used in the 50s and 60s with blacks?
Absolutely it is. So,
does it feel like sometimes the church keeps making the same mistakes on these issues?
To me, yes. And I think that the results of the last couple of decades would substantiate that.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Greg Prince. In our next conversation, we'll talk about how other churches deal with same-sex marriage. Greg serves on the board of directors for a Methodist seminary in the D.C. area, and we'll find out how they're struggling with this issue as well.
It puts them in a much more difficult position organizationally than the LDS Church right now, because there's the very real possibility of permanent schism, that the United Methodist Church might not wind up being very united anymore. They're trying to work out some kind of a compromise that can avoid that. And when I went to the board meeting earlier this week, Tom looked at me and he said, I never thought I'd see the day when the Methodists would make the Mormons look progressive.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please support Gospel Tangents and become a subscriber. For just $5 a month, go to patreon.com/gospeltangents and you can hear the entire interview. And you can also get transcripts available at either our Amazon website, or if you want to give the money to me and not Amazon, please subscribe on my website at gospeltangents.com and you can click the yellow subscribe button. Of course, we're also on Facebook, Twitter, and all the other places. Make sure you subscribe on iTunes at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents. And don't forget to click here to subscribe on YouTube, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some more of our great videos. Thanks again for listening.